Hilchos Shechitah Perek Shishi, the laws of ritual slaughter, chapter 6. We continue on the 8 categories of treifa. There are 8 categories of wounds that would make an animal considered to be mortally wounded, and it's not going to live for 12 months. The first category we learned yesterday, that's called drusa. Okay. Yes, pounced upon. Today and tomorrow, the topic is nekuva. Nekuva means punctured. And what we're going to see is that today, the Rambam is going to walk us basically from the top to the bottom of an animal's body and go through all the areas that puncture would affect it, with one exception, the lungs. Because the lungs have such a complex set of laws around their puncture that it's going to require a whole chapter. Tomorrow is all about the lungs. But today we're going to be going from the brain to the rectum and discussing all the limbs, veins, internal organs that if they're punctured, the animal becomes mortally wounded. So here we go. Nekuva ketzad. How does the puncturing work in terms of making an animal treifa? Achad asarei varim hein. There are 11 limbs in the animal's body. Sheim nikav echad mihen lachalolei b'mashu. That if one of them gets a puncture into its internal cavity, even the smallest amount, treifa, the animal is treif. And treif, although in today's context we use it as just non-kosher, it has a specific meaning in which it's considered like it's torn apart. It's not going to last for 12 months, and therefore even if you slaughter it now, it's not going to help. You basically have slaughtered a non-kosher animal in a way. The eluhain, they are the following. The Rambam gives us the list, and then he'll define them throughout the chapter and tomorrow. Tarbat saveshet, the entrance to the esophagus. Tarbat literally means the courtyard of the esophagus. Ukrum shal mayach harosh, the membrane of the brain. The halevim hakana shalai, the heart and its main artery. The hamara, the gallbladder. Uknei hakavet, and the artery of the liver. We'll soon define this. The hakeva, the hakeres, the hameses, ubeis hakaisis, the 4 stomachs of the animal. The Rambam over here goes kind of a little out of order, but the keva is the abomesum, the karis is the rumen, the meses is the omesum, and the beis hakaisis is the reticulum. The hadakin, the intestines. The hareya yimakana shala, and the lungs with its artery, which will be defined at length tomorrow. So the Rambam begins going in order. Tarbat saveshet. Oops, where are we here? Tarbat saveshet, the courtyard of the veshet, the courtyard of the esophagus means kvar be'arnu shiure. We've already explained what that refers to. V'shu ha'makam min haveshet she'eino roi lishchita l'mayla min haveshet. It's the area of the esophagus which cannot be slaughtered, just above the actual esophagus itself. So here the esophagus begins. Right up here, this area is called the courtyard of the esophagus, the entrance to the gullet essentially. And if that gets a hole, imnikav lachalale b'mashu treifa. If it gets a hole to the internal part of it, even the smallest amount, the whole animal is treif. So I believe that comes first, even though the brain in the animal is more frontal, because we've already explained it. Now that Rambam moves to the brain. Every mammal, humans, animals, have 2 membranes around the brain. Here I took from Google from a horse. These are called in English the dura mater and the pia mater. The dura mater is the membrane that's attached to the skull, to the bone surrounding the brain. Yes. And the pia mater is the membrane that actually encases the brain. So the Rambam says, Im nikav ha'elyon hasamuch la'etzem bilvad, if only the upper membrane, the dura mater, got a hole, the one that's next to the bone. If that one got a hole, harezu muteres, it is permitted. That's how the Rambam rules in the Shulchan Aruch. There's many more stringent opinions. The Ramah says it's actually forbidden, unless it's going to cause you a great loss. The Shach says, some say even behefsed meruba, even if there's a great loss, it's forbidden. But according to the Rambam, a hole in the dura mater is permitted. But if the lower membrane, the pia mater, the one that's next to the actual bone, the actual brain matter, gets a hole in it, treifa, then the animal is a treifa. Now, although it sounds like from the Rambam that he's referring to a hole only in the pia mater, the accepted consensus in the commentaries is that we're talking about over here if it also got a hole in the lower one. So in other words, both the dura mater and the pia mater got a hole, then it's a treif animal. Now, where does the brain end? If we look over here, you can see in the next picture, a top view of the animal's head. The brain in the end is going to become the spinal cord. It's going to kind of flow into the spinal cord. So where does the brain end in terms of the membranes? Says the Rambam, once the brain begins to be pulled in the direction of the spinal cord, outside of the poilin. The poilin are the occipital condyles. That's like two little balls, if you will, over here, that are at the end of the brain matter. They're basically a protuberance of the cranium. The bone surrounding the brain, a little bit sticking out. That's called the poilin. So once you leave the area of the occipital condyles, the membrane at this point has a different law. It's going to be discussed in chapter 9. It's not considered part of the brain, it's considered part of the spinal cord. And therefore, if an animal will get a hole in the membrane outside the area of the condyles, then it's actually going to be permitted because it's not surrounding the brain. But as long as it's around the brain, even the smallest amount of a hole disqualifies it. So that's all as far as things that are surrounding the brain. Halacha dalid hamoyach atzmoi shenikav. If the brain itself, the brain matter itself, gets a hole, according to the Kesef Mishnah, the wording here should be shenirkav. If it decayed, the brain matter decayed, or it got squishy, but the membrane encasing it is still intact. Ksheira, the animal is kosher. V'imnishbach kamayim, oinames kadoinag. But if the brain matter turns to liquid, it's pourable like water, or it's melted like wax, treifa, then the animal is a treifa. And as the commentators explain it, the Rambam puts it in this chapter because it relates to puncture. Once the brain becomes decayed to such a level, the membranes around the brain are certainly going to get a puncture. And once the membranes get a puncture, the animal is a treifa. So therefore, the Rambam puts it over here because it's part of the treifas related to puncture. So that basically covers the brain for as much as we can understand it. Now we move on to the heart. Says the Rambam, Halev shenikav lebeis chalolei. By the way, I should say all these pictures that I'm showing today are from the Art School Gemara in Chulin. They did a tremendous job with color pictures in the laws relating to treifas, and I'm indebted to them. Just tremendous illustrations that they've made. So, the heart. Here, you see what's called the larger chamber and the smaller chamber of the heart. In modern anatomy, we know that the heart is basically made up of one central large chamber with different smaller chambers around it. The different commentaries to the Talmud describe it somewhat differently. Some say there's the big chamber to the right, small chamber to the left. The Rambam actually speaks the opposite. You're going to see in a second. He has the large chamber on the left, small chamber on the right. The commentaries basically point out that they were just referring to different viewpoints. Everyone agrees that the basic shape of it is one bigger chamber with a bunch of smaller chambers. The question is which smaller chamber matters for these laws. But the Rambam nevertheless describes it as we're going to learn about it right now. Halev shenikav lebeis chalolei. If a heart of the animal gets a hole to its internal cavity, bein lechalol gadol shebesmoil, bein lechalol katan shebeyamin, whether to the large chamber on the left or to the small chamber on the right. The point is to the big chamber or to the small chamber. Treifa, the animal is treif. This is another one of those limbs that the smallest puncture makes the difference. Avalim nikav besar halev. But if only the meat of the heart got a puncture and it didn't reach the internal cavity, then mutter, it's actually permitted. Now, in Shulchan Aruch it says that that's only if the hole happens because of a natural sickness. But if we actually find that a thorn punctured the meat of the heart, then even if it didn't get to the internal cavity, we're stringent and we would make this animal treif. But according to the Rambam, it seems like as long as it was only the flesh, it's okay. Uknei halev, the artery of the heart, v'hu hamizrak hagadol sheyotze mimenu lareya, the large artery which goes from the heart to the lungs. I'll define that in a second. The main artery of the heart, says the Rambam, harehu kalev, is considered like the heart, v'imnikav lachalole b'mashuhu treifa, and if it gets a hole to its internal cavity, the smallest size, it's a treifa. Now, the Rambam describes this artery as coming from the heart to the lungs. That would match with today's anatomy of the pulmonary artery. That's the one that goes from the heart to the lungs. However, in the Talmud, it's clear that the knei halev, this artery of the heart, is covered in fat. The only artery that we know coming from the heart that's covered in fat is the aorta. This one right here, you see it goes from under the lungs, on top of the lungs, and it's encased in fat. So therefore, some commentators want to explain that Rambam over here means the aorta. The reason why he calls it the artery that goes to the lungs is not because it reaches to the lungs. It just goes towards the lungs in the anatomy of the animal. At any rate, whatever this artery is, if it gets a hole the smallest size, it's a treifa, like the heart. Now we move on to the liver and the gallbladder. So this is another picture from that Art School Gemara. You can see basically the full right side of the cow. Tons of different body parts of the animal that are related to these laws. I'm going to zoom in to this area here, which is the liver and the gallbladder. So we're going to bring the screen a little bigger. There it is. This is the liver. Okay, of course, it's all simplified view. And this is right here, the gallbladder. The gallbladder is basically a pouch that sits at the bottom of the liver. When the liver secretes bile, the bile is collected in the gallbladder, and the gallbladder, and it helps with digestion. So you can see in the picture, though, that the pouch of the gallbladder literally rests against the liver. So the Rambam says, Marda shenikva v'kaved soisma, if the gallbladder got a hole, and the liver is sealing the hole, so in other words, it got a hole in the space that's next to the liver, muteres, it's permitted. And this is going to be a repeated theme throughout this chapter, that a puncture that's effectively sealed is not considered to be a puncture. So here, a puncture at the edge of the gallbladder would be sealed by the liver, and therefore it's fine. But if the hole was not sealed effectively, even though it's right near the liver, and in a way it's kind of covering it, but it's not effectively sealed, treifa, the animal is a treifa. Now says the Rambam, what if it looks like there had to be a hole, but you can't tell? You don't see the hole. All you see is the result. Says the Rambam, Nazia shenimtzeis bamara. Nazia literally means a kernel or a seed. Some kind of a roundish object is found in the gallbladder. Doesn't belong there, it shouldn't be there. It was probably secreted from the liver. There's a little duct called the cystic duct that goes from the liver to the gallbladder. It probably came through there, but we need to understand what it is. So the Rambam says, if this kernel, the seed, has the shape of a date pit, which means she'ein reish achad, it doesn't have a sharp edge, it's blunt, muteres, then the animal is actually permitted, because while it was secreted, since it's blunt, it didn't make any holes on its way in. But if one of the edges is sharp, like the pit of an olive, it could have punctured something on the way in, says the Rambam, asura, this makes the animal forbidden, because it certainly punctured the gallbladder on its way in. The fact that you cannot see the hole is simply because there was a scab, it was covered, something happened, recovery began. But the fact that you see a result of a sharp seed, that tells you that it punctured on the way in. Now, the way this Rambam is being read super simplified. If you look in the source for it in the Talmud, it gets very complex. It seems like the puncture is not necessarily coming in the natural way from the liver to the gallbladder, as the Rambam implies it. It's actually whether the seed could have entered the gallbladder from a different part of the body, through a different way. Perhaps made a hole in the esophagus and the intestines. But the Rambam seems to be learning that it's all a reference to what was the path of this kernel from the liver to the gallbladder. If it's blunt, it came in, but it didn't make a hole. If it's sharp, it probably did make a hole and makes problems for the animal. Halacha ches. Let's move on to the liver itself. The next two halachot, I got to say, I'm not sure I fully understand them. I did a lot of research into the Gemara, the source for this, but the simple reading of the Gemara leads to a different interpretation than the Rambam. I'm going to present the way I understand it based on the Kesef Mishnah and his commentary here, but I'm leaving it open to the reader to offer another alternative explanation if it fits better in the words. Knei hakavet, the tubes in the liver. If you see a picture of the liver, okay, I didn't upload it here, but basically the liver, this mass over here, is full of small little tubes where the blood goes through its processing in the liver. Says the Rambam, those tubes, V'hein hamizrakin sheboy, shebohen adam mizbashel. The little arteries or the little blood vessels in the liver, in which the blood is cooked. So cooked is the word he uses, but it basically means filtered. Says the Rambam, im nikav echad mehen b'mashu treifa. If one of those little tubes gets a hole, even the smallest amount, the whole animal is treif. Lefichach, therefore, machat shenimtzeis b'chituch hakaved. A slaughterer slaughters an animal. He opens up the body, and in the liver, in a cut of the liver, he finds a needle. And again, as I'm going to interpret it based on the Kesef Mishnah, this needle is protruding somewhat out of the cut. It's not fully embedded in the liver. You find it half in, half out. Says the Rambam, im hoisa machat gedola, if it was a large needle. The reason why large is important is because on a large needle, only one edge is sharp, the other edge is really blunt. Where the eye is, it's actually blunt. So says the Rambam, if it was a large needle, and the sharp edge was facing inwards. Again, a big debate what facing inwards means, but we're going to say inwards means it's facing. Had it continued, it would have went out the liver into the internal cavity of the animal. Lifnim means into the internal cavity of the animal. So then, because its sharp edge is protruding, that means that when it entered the liver, its sharp edge was facing first. And hence, that sharp edge definitely made a hole into one of the tubes inside the liver. Because when something goes in sharp, it's going to be puncturing things on its way. You found that with the sharp edge protruding outwards, had it been left in the animal, it would be further going into the internal cavity of the animal. That means that it made a hole on its way in. But if the blunt edge, the eye, was the one facing towards the internal cavity of the animal, in other words, it came into the liver with its blunt backwards, with the blunt edge facing in, we can simply say, derech simpoines halcha, it came in through what's called the vena cava, the massive artery that leads everything to the liver. And it simply came in through the tubes regularly, but because its blunt edge was facing first, it didn't make any punctures wherever it went. Umuteres, and therefore the animal is permitted. That's my understanding of the Kesef Mishnah's commentary to this halacha. Hoysa machat ketana though, but if it was a small needle means, even though a small needle also has an eye and a sharp edge, technically, but nevertheless, because it's so small, hareza treifa. Either way, the animal is going to be treif, because a small needle, relative to the animal, both edges will be really considered sharp. And so it probably made a hole on the way in. If it was found in the large artery that leads into the liver, the middle wide artery through which food or blood enters the liver, then it's permitted. Because if it was just found in the pipe, it didn't have a chance to go into the liver yet, no holes were made in an improper place. Similarly, if the liver's meat became wormy, became rotten, it's also permitted. There's no worry about a puncture. Unlike when it came to the brain, let's say, like the brain, that if it only decays, it's okay. If it completely becomes watery, then it's a problem. So think over here, if the liver decays, it's still permitted. Okay, so we're moving now along. See the animal, we did the brain, we did the heart, we did the liver. Now we're moving to the stomach area. So for the stomach area, we remind ourselves of what's called the four stomachs. The animal has four digestive areas. The food comes in through the esophagus, goes into the rumen, where the food just begins to decay. Then it heads into the reticulum, where the food kind of becomes ball-shaped, little pieces. From there, it's regurgitated back to the esophagus so the animal can chew it. Then it goes all the way down into the hemsis, into the amesum, where it begins to be processed and actually digested, broken down. And finally into the cava, into the abomesum, where the gastric juices are, and then digestion is complete. So the Rambam begins with the cava, with the abomesum. Cava shenikva. The bottom stomach here, the abomesum, gets a hole. So we remember from the laws of forbidden foods that the abomesum is covered by two layers of fat. On the bottom, there's a more curvy layer of fat, which is forbidden. And on the top, there's a more straight layer of fat, which is permitted. So the Rambam says, Keva shenikva, if the Abba Mesam got a hole, the chelev toher seisei mesanekev, and the permitted fat is covering the hole. So it got a hole more to the top, where the straight fat, which is permitted, is covering it, is sealing it. Muteres, then it's permitted, because this permitted fat has a very flexible texture, and it will effectively seal the hole. The chein kol nekev. Truth is, also any hole, any puncture, shehabasarei hachelev hamuter ba'achila seisei meisai, that meat or permitted fat is sealing it. Harei ze muter, that's permitted, because again they have a flexibility and they can seal the hole effectively, with a couple of exceptions. Chutz, besides for mechelev halev, the fat of the heart, the hakrum sha'al halev kulei, and the membrane around the heart. We call this today the pericardium. It's like a membrane that holds the heart in place. And also, b'hamechitza shebe'emtza habeten, the partition, flat in the middle of the stomach, the muscular partition right here, this pink, the muscular partition in the middle of the stomach, hamavdeles ben evrei hamaychol ve'evrei haneshima, which divides between the limbs of eating and the limbs of breathing. In modern English, the thorax and the abdomen. It's the partition which you rip it away and it will reveal the lungs. We call this the tarpesh of the liver. English, the diaphragm. It exists in humans, it exists in animals. Once your breathing elements stop, there's a thing of muscle, a layer of muscle called the diaphragm, and under that is the abdomen. So that, if that gets a hole, as we'll see, that's one of the exceptions, even though fat is sealing it, it won't seal it well. The white area in the middle of the diaphragm, and the fat around the final end of the intestines, the rectum. Over here, the fat around them will not protect the hole because they're stiff. And because they're stiff, they don't wrap around the hole, they don't effectively seal it. And therefore, if a hole is sealed with one of these fats, it's not considered sealed. Fats in a beast, which the same fats in a domesticated animal would actually be forbidden to eat, because with a beast, there's much more room for leniency, much more of the fats are permitted. But if it's a type of fat which in an animal is forbidden, it doesn't do the stealing job, even though in the chaya, in the beast, it's permitted to be eaten. Doesn't matter. So that is the keva, the abamesim. Let's go to the next stomach here. Kares shenikav. If the rumen, the first stomach, gets a hole, treifa, the animal is treif. Nothing can seal it. Because the fat on top of it, this is called the chelev hamechase es hakerev, the greater omentum, is a forbidden fat, and forbidden fat doesn't effectively seal holes. Same thing if the omesum or the reticulum, the two other stomachs, got a hole. To the outside of them, treifa, they are treif. But if they got a puncture between them, the wall that they share, so the hole isn't to the outside of the animal, in other words, to the internal cavity, but simply between these two stomachs, mutaris, it's permitted. Halacha Yud Beis machat shenimtzeis ba'ivi beisakaisis mitzad echad. Let's go into the reticulum, the second stomach here. It has a pretty thick wall. If you find the needle in the thickness of the wall, so if it's only protruding on one side, in other words, the hole only went through part of the flesh, it didn't go through all the way, ksheira, it's kosher. But if it got a hole through and through, and it reached the internal cavity of the reticulum, and in addition to that, you found a drop of blood where the hole should be, where the hole was, treifa, the animal is treif. This needle punctured the stomach definitely before the animal was slaughtered. But if there's no blood where the hole is, then even if the hole is through and through, from side to side, it's permitted. No doubt, after the slaughter is when the needle pushed itself through and made the full puncture through and through. If a farmer forced down an animal's throat something which he knows will cause a hole somewhere down the line in the animal system, like the root of a Shechitah plant. I think I once showed this, I don't have a picture here, but when we did this the first time in the laws of Shabbat, I showed a picture of the Shechitah. a little piece of it, you throw it down the animal system, and it's going to for sure puncture the system. Treifa shevadai noikev. The animal at this point is considered a treifa because it will for sure make a puncture. But if the material that you forced down the animal's throat was a doubt whether or not it will make a hole, tibadek, check the animal. And then you'll see if it made a hole, treif, if not, not. Moving on to the intestines. Every one of the intestines where the leftover food turns in, they're called the small intestines. Here you have basically the intestinal system. Here's the, it kind of enters with the, here's the abomasum, the final stomach, goes into what's called the duodenum, the beginning of the intestinal system. Then it goes all the way into here, these small intestines, the dakim, they come into what's called the hadura decanta, the coil of the intestine, and then they go out through the cecum, and then to the rectum, those that are going to be thrown out. So the Rambam says, any of these small intestines here, if they get a hole, treifa, the whole animal is treif. At one point in the small intestines, there's a part of the intestines where it's super, super wrapped around each other. Very, very coiled. Like a snake, which coils itself. They're called the coil of the intestine. At this point, since they're so tightly wrapped, if one of them gets a hole into the other, it's actually kosher. Because its friend will protect it. In these small intestines, although they're also tightly packed together, a hole in one will not necessarily be covered by the other. But in the hadura decanta, in this area, they will be. If one of the intestines got a hole, and there's a fluid that's stuffing it, a little mucus that sticks to the inside of the intestinal lining, very sticky, and could actually serve as some kind of a sealant to the hole, says the Rambam, still treifa. The animal is treif, she'enzu stimo emedas. It's not a lasting sealant. It's not going to last. Interesting case. You're a shochet, taking apart the animal, you put everything, on the side, not like today where there's a massive assembly line, you're doing it in your backyard. And you put the intestines to the side, and all of a sudden out of nowhere comes a wolf or a dog and grabs the intestines. You chase the wolf or the dog. After it puts down the intestines, you check them out, they have a puncture. So is this the puncture that came before or from the animal? Says the Rambam, you can blame, so to speak, the animal and say that the intestines are permitted. We don't say that perhaps the wolf or the dog punctured the intestines at a point where they were already punctured. If you didn't see a wolf or dog, you simply find the intestines to be full with a hole. You don't know if the hole became before the slaughtering or after. So kind of like we had the other day with the esophagus, you do this over here also. You make another hole in the intestines and you compare. If the first hole looked like this one, it's kosher. They both came after the slaughtering. If there was a difference, that means that the hole came before the slaughtering and it's treif. If your hands had handled the doubtful puncture, you have to also first handle the hole which you're using for comparison. It has to be the exact same. Then you compare the two holes together. Basically, subject the second hole to any conditions the first one was subjected to, and then on comparison, if they're the same, it's kosher. If they're not, it's not kosher. If the intestines of the animal poured out of its body, it got a hole in its body, but the intestines themselves didn't get a hole, muteras, the animal is still permitted. Because at this point, even if an animal gets a cut in its stomach, the intestines can still be returned and heal. But if the intestines turned over as they came out, again, even if they have no hole, treifa, the animal is treif. Once the intestines kind of turn over, they cannot be restored to their original condition, and the animal will not live 12 months in this state. The final intestine, basically the rectum, where the animal literally, it's kind of straight tube. It's very tightly encased, you can see, between the bones of the hips, spinal cord on top. It's very, very tightly fitted. In the final intestine, it's straight tube, doesn't have any turning. The point at which feces comes out of the animal. It's stuck in between the haunches, the hip bones. In Hebrew, that's called a chalchailes, rectum. If at this point it gets a hole, the smallest amount, treifa. Kishara me'ayim, it's treif like any other intestine. But that's only if it got a hole where it's next to the internal cavity of the stomach, the abdominal cavity. But if it got a hole in this area, where it's literally stuck between the thighs, muteres, then it's permitted. Because the thighs will hold it in place, and the puncture will do nothing. Even if actually, not only is it punctured, but it's removed, as in over here. It was literally removed. Muteres, it's all permitted. So long as in the end of the day you have 4 finger breadths of length of the rectum, the rest is permitted even if it's all removed. It says that Rambam halacha yud zayin ha'oif. Till now we covered an animal. We went from top to bottom. Now a bird. It doesn't have the whole stomach system, the 4 stomachs, the rumen and the mesim and the reticulum. In the bird, the corresponding limbs would be the zefek, right here, the crop, toward the end of the esophagus, and the kurkavan, the gizzard. Besides for these 2 differentiating limbs, all other treifas are equal in an animal, a beast, and a bird. What about the limbs unique to a bird? It says the Rambam, v'zefek shanikav gagoy b'mashahu, the crop of an animal, which its roof got a tiniest hole, treifa, it's treif. Ve'ezeu gagoy shel zefek, what's called the roof of the crop, the part that's pulled with the esophagus when the animal pulls its neck forward, whatever part from the crop gets lifted, that's the roof of the crop, and if it gets a hole, it's forbidden. The rest of the crop which gets a hole is permitted. Now to the gizzard. There are 2 pockets, or 2 layers to the gizzard. The outer one is red like meat, the inner one is white like skin. If each layer got a hole without the other layer, muteres, it's permitted. They both must get a hole, at least the smallest size. If they both got a hole in different places, muter, it's permitted. With the esophagus, it also has 2 layers. We said on chapter 3 that if it gets a hole in 2 different places in each layer, it's forbidden. That's because, as the Talmud says, when an animal eats, the different layers of the esophagus can mesh, and the 2 holes may end up against each other. But with the gizzard, it doesn't move around that way, and so if there's a hole on this side of the outer one, this side on the inner one, they're not going to affect each other, and it's permitted. Halacha yutes hatchoil, the spleen. This is the spleen as it hangs in the actual animal, but if you look at the spleen a little closer, there's what's called the thick end and the thin end. The thick end is where it's attached to the stomach system, the thin end is just the hanging end on the animal. So the Rambam says the spleen is not one of the limbs that the smallest puncture size makes it a treifa. And therefore the sages didn't count it in the list of punctured limbs, because the list of punctured limbs is only the limbs that have the smallest size puncture make them a treifa. Instead, the spleen has a certain requisite amount that the hole has to be big enough to make it treif. And it's not the same on the whole spleen. Ketzad, what does that mean? The spleen, one end is thick, the other end is thin, like the tongue. The inner end is thick, the outer end is thinner. So if it got a hole on the thicker end, it goes like this. Nekev mefulash treifa. A hole all the way through, treif. V'imnikav nekev she'enim mefulash. If it's not all the way through, im nishar tachtav ka'oivi dinar shel zav mutar. If there's a thickness of a golden coin left over without a hole, it's permitted. Pachas mikan areu ki mefulash utreifa. Less than that is considered to be a hole through and through, and it's treif. That's all on the thick end. Avalim nikav hadak sheira. But if the thin end gets a hole, it's all permitted. It says that Rambam malacha chaf. Kol eiver she'amru chachamim bay. General rule for the whole chapter. Any limb about which the sages said that the smallest puncture makes it a treifa, kachim nital kule treifa. Also, its removal equals treif. Bein shen nital b'chayli, ay biyad, bein shenivra chaser, whether it was removed through sickness, it was removed manually, it was born without the limb. It's like punctured. It's treif. Also, if it had a double of that same limb, it says in the Talmud, kol hamosif goreya. Sometimes more is less. You have an extra limb, or it's called yeser kechaser. An addition is like lacking. So if it has a double limb, treifa. Shekala yeser kenatu chashuv. An extra one is like a removed one. Ketzad, what does that mean? If one of the intestines was totally removed, or the gallbladder was totally removed, or any one of those limbs, whether in a bird or an animal, treifa, the animal is treif. If it has two gallbladders, two intestinal systems, then it's treif, anything like that. But that rule only applies to the list of limbs that can be punctured at the smallest size. But with the spleen, if there's no spleen, or two spleens, it's permitted because it wasn't part of the list of the punctured limbs. And the final halacha, when we say an extra intestine that makes an animal treif, what does extra mean? A little extra? It means it's extra from beginning to end. There's literally two sets of intestines running alongside each other from beginning to end, as is in the bird sometimes. Or the extra organ is projecting like a branch, goes out of a main branch. There's a tree, big branch, and a small branch literally projects outward. It's literally separated. Whether in a bird or an animal, that's an extra intestine. But if the extra intestine is just simply a little extra pipe, which branches off and then comes back into the rest of the intestinal system, it becomes one from both ends. So they're just simply separated in the middle, so it starts off equal, goes to two, and then comes back into one. That's permitted, there's no extra there. Extra means a totally extra system.